You believe it, this man is actually going to grow potatoes on Mars. Because he had an accident while on a mission, he was abandoned on Mars by his teammates. His food reserves will only last him a year. But the next exploration of Mars is not due for another 4 years. In order to survive, Mark decided to grow his own rations for 3 years. First, he builds a potato hut in the capsule. But there is no further on Mars. What to do? That was easy. He took out the vacuum manure of his teammates, although this smells very topsy-turvy, but mixed the manure with the soil and stirred with water. The first bucket of manure on Mars is freshly baked. And now there's only one thing missing: water. Fortunately, the base has a large store of hydrazine. Burning the hydrogen from the hydrazine gives us plenty of water. Mark starts his experiment with confidence. But the next thing he knew, it had failed. After repeated attempts, this time the experiment finally worked. Water beads up on the plastic sheeting of the shed. After 54 days and nights, the first plant on Mars is born. The problem of food has been solved. The next step is to make contact with Earth as soon as possible. But his teammates thought Mark was dead, and a funeral is being held for him on Earth. Day 79. Mark harvests the first potatoes on Mars. The big ones are preserved. The small ones were kept as seeds and buried in the soil. That day, Mark suddenly remembered that on the Pathfinder, which landed on Mars in 1997, perhaps there was communication equipment on board. So he decided to go to the Pathfinder and try his luck. In the meantime, trajectory of his movements on Mars was transmitted back to Earth. Via satellite footage, the crew saw that the rover was moving. This meant that Mark was still alive. The news caused an instant sensation, and Mark was able to find the Pathfinder and bring it back to the base. The space agency also guessed Mark's intentions. By remote control of the Pathfinder, Mark finally made contact with Earth. But the 97-year-old device could only transmit still images. And there was a long delay. But NASA engineers taught how to access Pathfinder's communication system, and by reprogramming it to communicate in both directions. By rewriting the program, two-way communication was possible. The space agency decided to send Mark some food supplies to keep him going until the next Mars exploration mission. Mark was very impressed. But it would take at least 2 years to deliver this space delivery over such a long distance. Luckily, Mark has grown enough potatoes to keep him alive. But then an accident sends Mark into despair again. Mark is stranded on Mars all by himself. In order to survive, he grows potatoes from the dung of his teammates and solves the problem of water. But one night, the pressure chamber suddenly leaks. The chamber lost pressure instantly, and the whole potato shed exploded. All the potatoes were destroyed in an instant. Mark was able to repair the shed, but it was no longer possible to grow anymore. And he didn't have enough food left for the rescue. For years later, collecting the wreckage, now he can only hope for food supplies from Earth. The rocket, full of food, is already in the air on Earth's side. But due to the heavily compressed testing time, the rocket explodes just as it takes to the air. If the food doesn't arrive in time, Mark will die. Just as NASA and Mark were in despair, China stepped in. In order to rescue Mark, China's space agency decided to abandon Project Aliosan to send a ready-made rocket to resupply Mark. But even then, Mark's existing food would not last long enough for the supplies to be delivered. Then a physics genius came up with a brilliant idea. Mark's teammate's spacecraft would cancel its return to Earth, and it would have to orbit the Earth with a gravitational slingshot. The ship would fly straight to Mars at a much faster speed. Mark would then use the launcher on Mars to docking with his teammates. The plan was perfect, but the risks were too great. The risks in the middle were too great. NASA rejected the plan outright. But when the team learned that Mark was still alive, they didn't hesitate. They unanimously decided to rescue their comrade. They changed the route of the flight directly and privately. NASA had to agree. The Chinese rocket lifted off without a hitch. Everyone cheered. The team also successfully docked with the sun god and got their supplies. Everything was going according to plan. But then a new problem arose. Mark needed to dock with his teammates in space on a launcher. But Mark's launcher can't reach the intended altitude. This will cause him to miss the rendezvous with his teammates. The only way to do this was to reduce the weight of the launcher. That's when he had an amazing idea. The 466th day that Mark has been stranded on Mars. With the help of NASA, he is now finally going home. In order to successfully rendezvous with his teammates, he has decided to remove everything from the launcher that he can't use. The launcher was too heavy to fly to the specified altitude. The seat, the console, and even the top cover were not needed. He then put a plastic sheet over the top of the launcher. And so, with the world watching, he flew this. The open-top version of the rocket has flown off to Mars. The team had already reached their designated altitude. The impact was so great that the force of the impact shattered his ribs. The sheer velocity of the impact knocked him out instantly. Everyone on the planet is holding their breath. Some cheered him on. Some prayed for him. But the launcher still hadn't reached enough altitude to complete the docking. At this point, the captain made an amazing move. She chose to blow the airlock in front of the ship, using the thrust of the explosion to slow it down. The captain then pilots the craft to the outside of the capsule and prepares to rescue Mark. But even with the rope pulled to its maximum length, there was still a considerable distance between them and Mark. Just as they are in a dilemma, Mark wakes up and cuts his suit using the leaking gas as propulsion to fly towards his teammates. Just in the nick of time, he finally got a hold of his captain with determination and a desire to survive. Mark. He survived for almost 2 years on the distant planet Mars. At last, he miraculously survived.